our website. So let's move on, less of my wittering introduction, and let's move on. So what we've got today is two excellent presentations on the topic of oral health inequalities from quite different perspectives, which is exactly what we want. So what I'll firstly do is introduce our first speaker, and that is Dr. John Rogers, who is a principal fellow at the University of Melbourne. And John and myself were just chatting beforehand, and I actually met John over 30 years ago when he came to London. So it's a long-standing connection with John. And we were also just reflecting, Vanessa and myself is, and I'll make John blush now, but in Australia, particularly in Victoria, John and Julie and many others have done some incredibly progressive work in terms of oral health promotion, looking at the evidence base of health promotion. And I really think, without upsetting other people, Victoria in particular sort of led the world in this field with the quality of the resources that have been published. I really do actually mean that. Absolutely. So it's great. It's absolutely great to have John speaking this morning. What we're going to do is each presenter will speak for around 30-35 minutes. And then what we'll do is take questions from the audience. Now, I would prefer if people ask questions, because then I think it's more interactive. But if people also want to put questions in the chat function, that's fine. But after each presentation, we'll take a series of questions and then move on to the second presentation. So over to John Rogers, Principal Fellow from the University of Melbourne. So John, do you want to share your slides, and then you can, and actually one question, could I ask everyone to go on mute just when John is speaking to avoid any screaming babies or barking dogs or other distractions that can happen. So over to you, John.
Thank you, Richard. And I am blushing in the cold of the Melbourne winter. It's very generous what you've said about our efforts in Victoria, but it's a whole team that's behind that. Well, good morning to those in the Northern Hemisphere, and good evening to those in the Southern Hemisphere. It really is a privilege to be speaking with you today about my experience in trying to keep oral health on the policy agenda with the idea of promoting health and reducing inequality. And I was at the Department of Health in Victoria for 30 years. And as Richard said, now I'm at the University of Melbourne, and I'm pleased to share with you some insights about that time, about keeping oral health on the policy agenda. So firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I am, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. I'd also like to acknowledge my colleagues in Australia and all around the world that I've met on this journey. Dental health, public health, as we know, is about organised community efforts, and therefore needs to be a collective effort. And I'm very pleased that I've been part of the collective. Just a little bit about my background. I studied dentistry a long time ago in Adelaide, went to the Northern Territory where I worked with Bruce, and I say hi to Bruce, who's joined us from Alice Springs. I travelled for about 18 months and then ended up in Papua New Guinea for 3 years as a provincial dental officer. And I realised that dental public health was my calling, and so I went to Ann Arbor, University of Michigan, to do a Masters of Public Health. And then it was my turn, my partner's turn to study. So we went to London, and there I got a job in South London with Stanley Gelbier for a year, and left dental public health for a few years and worked in community health, firstly in North Yemen in an Oxfam funded project, and then in rural Victoria as manager of a community health centre. Then I joined the department and was there for 30 years. So it's a wonder, it was no wonder that I look a bit old. Why 10 insights or learnings? When I was in London in 1981, I met Aubrey Shine, and he suggested that I should present 10 findings from my mini thesis from the MPH, which was on oral health promotion. And that's where I've got the 10 from, to recognise what impact he's had on my career. His insightful thinking, his persistent advocacy has really helped shape my journey. So here we go, 10 insights, ideas or concepts learned from attempting to keep oral health on the policy agenda in a health department for 30 years. These aren't necessarily original thoughts. They're ideas and concepts I've picked up on the journey that make sense to me, and I hope some of them will be useful to you. So these are the 10 that I'll go through. Understanding the making of oral health policy, using a framework, and I have benefited from using Kingdom's framework with the 4 Ps we'll talk about. Having empathy for the poor minister, whoever would get that job, and working with the health department, bridging the research policy divide, and tools for the journey. What is the policy agenda? And I'm sure you're aware of this. It's those issues that get attention from decision makers, from policy makers. In health, there's considerable competition. As you all know, there's over 80 body parts, and each of those seem to have an advocacy group, and some more than one. There's many social health issues, so it is a crowded space. Someone suggested that health issues are like lifts, and some are going up in prominence, some are going down, and some are stuck. So the challenge is to try and get our particular policy rising up the policy agenda. I'm sure you're aware of this, how public oral health policy can cover 5 particular areas. The first legislation, when I got into the department, legislation seemed like the most boring thing. You had to worry about each word, each particular clause, but I now understand how it is vital in areas such as community water fluoridation, workforce regulation, and there's thankfully been considerable movement in those areas in Victoria over the last 30 years, including the scope of work for dental therapists who, when I went into the department, were under the supervision, direction and control of dentists. And now their work is recognised, and they're becoming independent oral health professionals. Budget decisions, of course, are really vital. Regulations as we've seen in COVID, policy rules, strategy plans in Australia, that's both at the national level and the state level. Public policy, public health policy is about choices in distribution of limited resources. And it's very political about who gets what, where, how and why. It's that process by which governments transform their political visions into programs based on ideas and values, and also with an eye to getting re-elected, of course. It involves many players and can be contested, relies on individuals, organisations and connections. And it's not always rational, comprehensive, sequential, or copied to what researchers see as appropriate levels of evidence. And it can be messy. I'm sure you've heard the statement that there's two things in life that really shouldn't be watched. And one is making sausages and the other is making legislation. So it helps to have a framework when trying to simplify the world. And the framework that I've found quite useful is Kingdon's agenda setting theory. That has 4 Ps. It has the problems and framing the problem and getting it on the policy agenda, looking at proposals that are available to solve that problem, looking at the politics, the motivation and opportunity, and waiting for a policy window. According to Kingdon, moving an idea up the policy agenda involves those 3 stages of problems, proposals and politics, and waiting for the policy window. And this framework has been relevant for the major initiatives that have occurred in general public health. Unfortunately, they haven't happened enough, but this can help explain how and why initiatives are taken up. A similar sort of lens was proposed by Benzie and colleagues in this paper, which looked at sort of the international state and proposed there's international neglect in global oral health. They reviewed political power in those areas of framing ideas, the issues, the features of the problem, looking at the actors and looking at the political context. So a lot of similar views to the Kingdon framework. So firstly, and sort of this third learning or insight is about framing problems. There's more success if problems are perceived as serious and the issues strike an emotional chord. They need to be real and relatable to policymakers. Young children having general anaesthetics, impact of long waits for public dental care, the high cost of dental care for low-income families have been just some of the problems that have caught the attention of policymakers in Victoria. The use of strong facts is what I think you're all about as researchers or policymakers. One strong fact that an Australian politician uses is couched in a question. And his question is, what is the difference between older, richer and poorer Australians? And his answer is 6 teeth. And that helps frame the problems for those who aren't sort of in the oral health environment. So that's looking at a DMFT of 14 for concession card holders and 8 for non-concession card holders for older people. The other thing about strong facts is that policymakers can be wary of over-exaggeration. So when President Obama was talking to a seminar of periodontists, he finished his talk with floss or die. And I think that could be seen as over egging the pudding, and it can affect the trust that we have with decision makers if you're seen to be exaggerating. Presentation is really key. People have different learning styles. It can be sort of visual or verbal, social, logical, or combination. So we need to be aware of the audience that we're talking to. Human interest stories are quite important. Sometimes I think researchers feel that that's, in a way, not an appropriate level of evidence. It's sort of too low in the level of evidence. But as a public health advocate in Australia has noted, as humans, we love stories. We thrive on them much more than research. Obviously, adopting a common risk factor approach is really key, and Richard's been great in his writing on that area. And when talking to politicians, it's also useful, I found, to acknowledge that there have been some improvements in oral health because they've seen it in their own children compared with their grandparents. So it's appropriate to acknowledge that. So you acknowledge the improvements in health, but say there is much more to be done, Minister. So fourth learning is around proposals. Kingdon suggested that proposals for them to be adopted need to be technically feasible, compatible with decision makers' values, reasonable in cost, and appealing to the public. And it's not just an oral health focus that we should be putting forward. Programs can assist families by saving them money and time. So the most recent initiative in Victoria is a over $300 million version of a school dental program. It's called the Smile Squad, and the government is selling that, promoting it as a program to save families money and time. It has a positive financial and convenience impact. As far as proposal ideas, there's the common risk factor approach, and economic evaluations have been important. For example, in getting community water fluoridation extended in rural Victoria. One strong fact that helped in that happening was that the 25 years of the fluoridation of Melbourne has led to a $1 billion saving in dental treatment costs. As far as resources are concerned, the middle one is the resource that Richard was talking about, and I must recognise his role because he helped in peer reviewing that and improved it immensely. Thank you, Richard. I keep finding myself coming back to Ottawa Charter. I think these days people would sort of talk about more commercial determinants as well as the social determinants. But I think it's a good framework to consider what interventions are possible. And the FDI Oral Atlas presents data in quite an interesting and informatics way. And that can be quite helpful when talking to policymakers. The Victorian Action Plan has been released last year, and what I think it's important here is that we managed to get targets included. Politicians can be a bit wary about targets. In this case, we had a long time span, and I think maybe they thought, well, 2030, who's going to be around then? But it was positive that they agreed to include those targets. And so that's a way to hold the department and the ministers accountable by looking at the progress against those targets. The commandments of influencing government. John Thwaites was a Deputy Premier of the state of Victoria, where Melbourne is the capital, and also the Minister for Health from 1999 to 2002. And when he left the ministry, he brought down 10 commandments. So this is what a politician is saying, what influences government. And those 10 commandments can be divided into political awareness, framing of problem and proposal, and communication style. So, it's what Kingdon talks about: political awareness, know what the government wants to achieve, and understanding government policies. The framing of problem proposals, also in Kingdon's model, alternatives and priorities, say something new, identify key stakeholders, collaborate and be part of a team. And then with the communication style, be clear in your advice, get the timing right, put effort into communication, and be honest. There are many factors that influence decision-making. Again, there's the political context. There needs to be the capacity, the system structures, the resources. Obviously, evidence and judgment comes in, timing. That action plan that I showed you, which has the date 2020, we started writing that in 2016, and the date kept being progressed. So timing can take a long time, but as you're aware, it can also happen quickly. So with the COVID crisis, telehealth, telemedicine has become an item in the Medicare system, and people have been working on that for years, but it took 2 weeks for the funding to be approved for that. And other policy factors involve all the key factors, and you're aware of all of those, including the media. And they don't all have the same ideas or values. So the policy window, that's can be elections, a change of minister, or budgets. So times when politicians can propose new public health policy. The trick for making policy is balance, but some ministers are prepared to break eggs, others are very risk averse. Someone has said that it's about gaining the most electoral impact for the least negative reaction, or trying to pluck the most feathers from the chicken with the least noise. So the 7th of the 10 areas, empathy for the minister. I mean, you're very aware of the hundreds of pieces of correspondence, the need to attend many meetings, the party obligations and public events. So it's often difficult to get in touch with ministers, and that's why their advisors are often very important. Some of those can be very good, some of those can be very young, and you just sort of wonder how they got there. But advisors can be very important. There are limits to power. Some ministers yearn to get into the position and have their hands on the levers of power, but they often find that the levers aren't connected to very much. A minister faces competition, not just from opposition parties, but from other ministers who might be jockeying for influence. And most ministers are after increases in budget to spend on their portfolio. Someone said, if you want a friend in politics, you get a dog. Personal stories are really important. Ministers can have experiences and backgrounds that make them more likely to support oral health. I've got 3 short stories, but tell me, Richard, how's our time going?
You're okay, John. I'm enjoying the friends of politics. I'll get a dog, so you keep going.
Well, the Premier's denture is the first story. The Premier, this is the state of Victoria, was in a rural town on a weekend and needed his denture repaired. This was back in sort of early 1970s. He couldn't find a dentist, but found an advanced dental technician who repaired his denture well and at a low cost. So the advanced dental technicians at that time were lobbying to be allowed to provide dentures direct to the public. The dentists were vigorously opposing. But after the Premier's experience, he became a supporter of the ADTs and helped that legislation through. The story of the minister's daughter. It was before an election, and the minister was being lobbied to support a public dental program, and he showed no interest. Until one meeting, he suddenly showed interest and became a supporter. He had taken his daughter for dental treatment, and he saw how expensive it was, and that had raised oral health on his policy agenda. The final story is about the health minister's father. The father had been criticising his daughter for underperforming until he had dental care at a recently opened community dental clinic. He praised his daughter warmly for implementing this new initiative. At the next election, there were only 2 health commitments, and one was an expansion of dental health. The final point there is the lift conversation, or I think the Americans call it the elevator pitch. So it's having a summary of the problem and possible solutions if by chance you happen to have a meeting with the minister, if you run into them in the lift, for example. The Department of Health, I suppose all of you are in different health systems, and the health department will have possibly different roles in each of those jurisdictions. Often the policy role is to provide advice to government on what to do, not to do, and how, to provide frank and fearless advice. But I know that's not always the case. For example, our Australian government has told public servants, don't worry about frank and fearless advice, just implement our policies. But it's not that way in Victoria, and we do have public servants able to provide frank and fearless advice. How can you support department staff, developing relationships. A secretary of the department a few years ago pushed RCTs, not random controlled trials, but random coffee times. So having the opportunity to meet with colleagues in the department, understand where they're coming from, what they see as proper research projects, help them with providing evidence and the strong facts so that they can be prepared for policy windows, because bureaucrats do have opportunities to get on the policy agenda. Often that's not shared generally, but they need to be well informed. Understanding timing, so the budget that comes out here, it's in May, that's started being prepared 9 months before. So it's not much lobbying, not much worth of lobbying in March or April, because the budget's often pretty well locked down. No surprises. This might seem a bit strange, but to help with your relationship with department staff, departments understand there's going to be bad news. That's inevitable. But if there's some heads up, if they're given some forewarning, it means that they can inform their manager, and there can be a preparedness. That's not always useful for advocates, but for, say, sort of lower impact stories, it can strengthen the relationship you have with health department staff. And so can sharing success stories. You know, there are a lot of bad news stories, but success stories that you've had can gladden a bureaucrat's heart. And so that's shared by your colleague up the line, and more joy can result, and that can help maintaining oral health on the policy agenda. Bridging the research policy divide, well, it's understanding what's driving policymakers, and the relationship between policy makers and research has been described as somewhat like dancing with strangers. It's also mentioned that it's like researchers have some pieces of the jigsaw puzzle and policymakers have some others, but they're in different rooms. So the more contact, the better. We've talked about different levels of evidence, and the policymakers may take a wider view of what is considered evidence compared to researchers' more sort of scientific lens. As I've mentioned, decision makers use stories to persuade others. They also use metaphors and analogies. The facts and evidence needs to be firmly anchored in moral politics. If people don't care about something, they're not likely to act on the evidence. And as far as sort of presentation of research advice, it's useful to consider the PR factor as well as the P factor. And again, I'm suggesting get to know health department officers. So sort of my final sort of thought or insight, you know, what are the tools for the journey for people who are in a policy role in departments? I think humour is important, maybe more a sense of the ridiculous. You can get pretty crazy at times in the department, really pressured, where the urgent can push out the important areas. Perseverance, kindness, that's loving kindness to self and others. Sort of the empathy, putting yourself in others' shoes, egalitarian values, I think are all part of a toolkit for success. Being on top of the data and maintaining some passion. Exercising policy humility. So that's seeking advice and broader views, not believing that you know all the answers. Curiosity. There are many issues being discussed in a health department, and it helps if you have curiosity to find out ways that you can add the oral, to the cancer plan or the disability plan. I think curiosity is a good attribute. And then having a support group, a community of interest, can be really helpful, and that's part of the role of ICOHIRP, and I think a very important role. I'm not sure how many of you have come across Thomas Maguire's book, The Tooth Trip. This is where it would be good if we were in one room together and you could put up your hands, but that is not the case. It was written in the 1970s in a very sort of Californian way. It's very cool, man. But he had the aphorism, be true to your teeth or they will be false to you. Now, I've tried to get that into a minister's speech, but it never made any final drafts. But if you could use it, please feel free. Please feel free. So finally, these are the thoughts, the ruminations, the insights I've had. And in closing, I'd like to say that while we do need to be true to our teeth, we also need healthy environments for all that make these healthy choices the easier choices. So thank you, and I'll leave you with Margaret Mead. Thanks.
Thank you very much, John. Thank you very much indeed. Do you want to stop sharing so we can see everyone, and you can see everyone clapping for you? That really was an excellent overview. I actually felt quite emotional at times when you were speaking. It sort of felt like we were talking about a different time and place. Are you able to, if you just unclick, unshare maybe?
That's what I thought I did, but I'll... sorry, I'll get there.
Not to worry. No, perfect. Thank you.
Yeah.
So that really was an absolutely lovely overview, insight, and I think your sort of emotional insight into the policy arena is what was particularly sort of powerful. There were some brilliant one-liners, random coffee times. That seems like a blast from the past, really, but it really does tap in to how isolated we all are, really. And looking at the screen, it sort of makes you even feel more isolated that we haven't been together and met together. But let's open up now for some questions, because 30 years plus of policy experience. This is a unique opportunity to ask John, to challenge him, to tease him. Any questions, comments, observations? You maybe put your hand up, or Julie, a fellow colleague from Victoria.
Thank you, John. I really enjoyed that. There's some great pearls in there for all of us. One of the question I had was around egalitarian values, and I wondered, I found that odd that you would say that was useful right across the political spectrum. I just wondered if you'd comment on, you know, left and right wing politics and how egalitarian values play out in that sort of policy support environment.
Thanks, Julie. That's a very good question. You know where more of the skeletons are hidden, so I thought it might have been a different question, but the sort of it's politics. It's politics, and it's about where politicians want to put their scarce resources. I think that to maintain sort of a passion, you need to have some sense about how the world is unequal and how that needs to change. But in my experience, all political persuasions can be convinced to put money into general public health. More conservative governments put more money into reducing the cost of private care. More left-leaning governments believe in bigger governments and put more money into public programs. But I think in every heart, maybe some neoliberals, I'm not sure, but there is a sense of fairness. I guess, you know, that's what I hope.
Okay, thank you, Julie, for the question. We've got some nice comments from some colleagues in Australia congratulating you, John, in terms of the feedback. But any questions, any more questions from our audience? Mishu, I can see your hands up.
Thanks, Richard. Thanks, John. Thank you very much, John. It was a great presentation. I just had a query about one of the slides where you showed the Victorian Action Plan for 2020 to 2030, and you
Yes.
showed some percentage, like the 85% reduction of children without cavity, 23% reduction of gingivitis, that type of percentages. So I was wondering, like, from where these specific percentages came from, like the evidence-based, or how that was determined. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Well, we've got Martin Whelan joining us, who works for Dental Health Services Victoria, and he helped us look at the existing data that we had, and we looked at what trends there were. And so the guesstimates, we put a bit of a stretch challenge there that if the performance was sort of trending well, we didn't have a straight line from that. We pushed it a bit. So it was based on the data that we could gather. We wanted to have an inequality target, but that was sort of very hard to do. And I'd be interested another time talking to people about what sort of inequality target we could have included.
Okay, good question. Maybe a final question, but perhaps John. Oh, sorry, we've got Nigel Carter. Nigel.
Sorry, just unmuting myself. Less a question than congratulations on a fantastic presentation. I do wish it's one that I'd heard 5 or 6 years ago before taking on a role as chair of the Platform for Better Oral Health in Europe. We're a lobby group consisting of a number of organisations specifically looking just at lobbying the European institutions, and I think your insights are absolutely invaluable. It took us a long time to learn what some of these triggers in terms of shaping and influencing policy were, And I think this is essential for anybody that's involved in that field. So fantastic presentation, thank you.
Thank you, Nigel. Thank you, appreciate that.
And we have now got a question from Jenny Godson from Public Health England. So Jenny.
Hi, John. Again, thanks for the presentation. Wonderful. It was really just to ask for some advice. And I think with your long years, you will have some good advice for me. You know, it seems sometimes working in the political arena that you just begin to make traction and make progress when there's a reorganization or a pandemic or something else. And you feel like you've gone back to the beginning again almost. What advice would you give? It must have happened in your long career. What advice would you give us?
Keep your sense of humor. Things can work out in unusual ways. So we could have been working with some health bureaucrats and, you know, finding out what their triggers are. And then they'd leave. But some of them ended up in Treasury or Prime Ministers in Cabinet. And there they were oral health advocates. So perseverance, you know, good luck.
So don't despair. They might have more influence where they end up.
Exactly. Yes.
Okay, good tip. Thank you.
Good question, Jenny. And by the way, Jenny's doing great work with Public Health England because she's our national lead for oral health improvement and is achieving great things in England as well. So we can learn a lot from Jenny as well.
Oh, good.
I think Marco Perez has a question. I can see a chat.
Yeah. Hi, John. Congratulations on your presentation. Very nice. I'm curious about your journey, about one particular aspect, your find to add the oral health into the Medicare. Could you make some comments about this long journey and the perspectives that you see to break this dental divide, if you like? Thank you.
Well, yes, it has been a long journey. Medicare, in a slightly different form, came into the Australian health system in the 1970s, restructured in the 1980s, and each time there was some discussion about including dentistry. The dentists were against it in the 70s. The dentists aren't as much opposed now, especially to if there's a focus on older people, and it could be time with the election coming up within the next 12 months that a coalition of oral health and welfare advocates really push for a program for older people, especially in residential aged care settings. That came out of the Grattan report paper as the first step in a dental care. It's been mentioned in the Royal Commission into aged care. So we could be getting there, Marco, but we need an organised effort to get it high up on the policy agenda for the election.
Good. Okay, well, look, thank you very, very much indeed, John, for that, as I say, excellent presentation. I think we've really enjoyed it and found it really insightful. So many, many thanks. So maybe we can all do a clap, either virtual or whatever, but thank you very much. So let's move on to our second presentation. And our second presentation is from Dr. Vanessa Muirhead, who is a clinical senior lecturer in dental public health, an honorary consultant dental public health at Barts in London, in London. And Vanessa is a very successful dental public health academic in the UK and internationally. Previously also worked in Canada with David Locker. So Vanessa's topic today is intersectionality and oral health, a journey of exploration. So over to you, Vanessa.
Good morning. Can you hear me? Can everyone hear me?
Yep, very clear.
Excellent. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, everyone in the UK, and good evening to anyone in a different time zone, especially Australia. Thank you, Richard, for inviting me to this presentation. And John, what a fantastic presentation. I was sharing with John earlier that we first met, John, at the IADR conference in 2018, and I had a bit of a fan moment because obviously we used his resource, and I thought, oh my gosh, that's John, the evidence-based industry. So excuse me. Thank you so much, John. That was a great presentation. And although I have not had a 30-year journey and so many fantastic insights, I will be sharing my journey towards intersectionality in this presentation. So a little bit about me, as Richard said, I'm a clinical senior lecturer in dental public health at Queen Mary University of London. I first qualified as a dentist at Barts in London many years ago, before I moved into community dentistry as a dentist working in London and in the Southeast. I then returned to do my MSc at UCL at Queen Mary many years ago, with Richard, with Aubrey, with Wagner Marcinis. And so I'm happy to say that I'm an offspring of Aubrey Sharham. And then he was the one that really sparked my interest in research when he came into the PhD and the MSc room and said, Vanessa, have you thought about doing a PhD, which I hadn't at the time. So as Richard said, I was fortunate at that time. David Locker at University of Toronto was looking for PhD students, and I acquired a PhD scholarship. So I spent time doing my PhD at the University of Toronto. And then I was fortunate enough to move to McGill University in Montreal to do a postdoc, where I was introduced to qualitative research methods. And then after 7 long years in Canada, I decided to cross the pond again, return to the UK and complete specialty training and take up my post. So I see myself as having British academic roots and North American branches. But what's been a consistent characteristic of my career, as it's something that John mentioned in his presentation, is curiosity. I've always been fascinated by questions and asking novel questions that have taken me on a journey, and that has led to this journey towards intersectionality. So in this presentation, I'm going to be sharing some of the journey that I've had exploring intersectionality that we showcased in our paper, What is Intersectionality and Why is it Important in Oral Health? We published this in the Community Dentistry Oral Epidemiology Journal last year. So I will first start with just exploring the journey, giving you some highlights of what are some of the key intersectionality principles. I'll then provide a précis of what approaches have been used in oral health research so far, and also then move on to a discussion about power in dentistry. And then I will share the next stage of the journey, where I'm beginning to look at intersectionality in the dental workforce. So yeah, I am an avid traveler before COVID-19. I love traveling. And I've found that traveling with companions is much more enjoyable, just like research. So I have to first acknowledge the fantastic researchers that I've been working with. That we've been working together for the last 3 years, collaborating on a series of papers that have really sought to promote debate, stimulate discussion in the oral health community. So Janine Doughty is a PhD student at UCL. Professor Ruth Freeman is a professor in dental public health in University of Dundee, who I met through Janine. Mary Ellen, again, is a fantastic medical anthropologist at McGill University, who I met through my postdoc. And finally, Adrienne Milden is a social scientist. She has a background in gender and health and race inequalities. And she's now at Brunel, and I met her through working in global public health at Queen Mary. So where did the journey begin? The journey began in 2018. We led an IADR symposium. Janine and I chaired this symposium on social inclusive dentistry. And we wrote a commissioned narrative review that we published, the first in the series, which Ruth led on. And we began to touch in that paper about intersectionality, and that really sparked my interest and made me very inquisitive about the whole notion of intersectionality. And that led me to delve into the concept of intersectionality in our second paper. And just to highlight that we have a paper that's under review led by Mary that's looking at vulnerability. So what is intersectionality? So Kimberly Crenshaw first coined the phrase intersectionality in 1989, it's about 30 years ago, while she was working as a law professor for UCLA. And she drew her insights actually from a case. It's a gender and race discrimination case that a group of Black women brought against General Motors at that time. And the court actually ultimately dismissed the case because at that time, anti-discrimination laws really only looked at race and gender separately. And the women couldn't really prove discrimination because not all women face discrimination at General Motors. And neither could they prove racial discrimination because not all Black people were discriminated against. So Crenshaw's argument from a feminist perspective was that Black women faced greater discrimination because of the way in which racism and sexism intersect within the society. This gave way to the concept of intersectionality, which has really evolved as a framework or a lens over the last 30 years, and it's been applied in different disciplines. So intersectionality essentially fundamentally describes the ways in which multiple identities intersect and interact. And these result in unique outcomes and experiences for people. So these identities can intertwine and shape people's life experiences and the opportunities that people face. Some identities are associated with privilege, while others are associated with disadvantage. So this means that some people can have concurrent privilege, such as if you're heterosexual or if you're in class, or disadvantage, maybe because of a minority status, such as sexuality and low socioeconomic status. So someone placed at the intersection, as we can see in this graph, in the table, will be hit from both sides. So really, essentially, intersectionality, rather than being reductionist, focusing on a single category, such as gender or race, intersectionality recognizes these multiple intersections and the complexity that this brings. So this is the first key feature of intersectionality. The second feature of intersectionality is the notion of power. So intersectionality includes explicit awareness and recognition of power. So power from an intersectional perspective is always relational. And so an individual can simultaneously experience both power and oppression in different contexts. And I'm not sure how many of you were aware of the fascinating social media viral post last year, the Amy Cooper Central Park video last year. I don't know how many people saw that. But for me, this was a fascinating illustration of the way in which power operates within an intersectionality lens. So for those of you who don't know, Christian Cooper was a bird watcher, and he recorded his encounter with Amy Cooper when he confronted her for not having her dog on a leash in Central Park. So Amy Cooper is female, she's white, she's middle class, but she's living in the historical context of race in the US, where there is a legacy of slavery, fear of white women against Black women. In contrast, we've got Christian Cooper. He's African-American, he's middle class, and he's male, but he's also living in a political context where you have encounters between Black people and police. So in this context, Amy demonstrates her intersectionality power and her position in her power when she threatens to call the police and falsely accusing him of threatening behavior. I think that's just a really classical demonstration, which leads us also onto the next idea of context and why context is so important. So thirdly, intersectionality operates within a specific time and context. So race and gender will have varied meanings at different times. So in this photo, you can see a picture here, and this is a Windrush generation. And this is the first migrants to the UK from the Caribbean. And this is my parental generation. This will be my parents and grandparents. And so their lived experiences of race in the UK will be very different from my experiences. And the second photo here is of Ford workers, so female Ford workers who were protesting in 1968 about low wages. So again, the concept of gender and gender rights will be very different today than it would be in 1968. And finally, if we look at, in the last picture, looking at Indigenous populations in Australia, the concept of race and the experiences of Indigenous people will be different, say, from people in marginalised people in the UK, US. So it's really important that when we look at intersectionality, that we look at it within a given context. In our paper, we also describe the concept of weak and strong intersectionality on this continuum. So what we mean by weak intersectionality is really research that usually uses data that's in an ad hoc fashion, usually atheoretical, opportunistic, and oftentimes this is because we've used secondary analysis. And in contrast, when we look at strong intersectionality is theoretical, it's methodological, and it embraces the concept of power. And I think there's a recent example of a paper that's moving on that spectrum, which was written by the Jemison Group in Australia, where they looked at intersectionality and racial discrimination in oral health. We also, in the paper, describe the concept of the difference, drawing on Dill and Coleman's perspective about descriptive research and transformative research. So descriptive research is really asking sort of the what, the why, the how questions, whereas transformative research is really seeking to go beyond that and looking at action research. How can we make changes? How can we use research to actually drive social change and also address power structures? So what do we know about how intersectionality has been applied in oral health? So when we wrote the paper in 2019 to 2020, we could only identify 6 articles that had applied some level of intersectionality. So looking at oral health inequality research, the tendency has really been to use single categories such as race, ethnicity, or sexuality. And also we have a tendency to aggregate the data. So we aggregate ethnic groups or gender. And this has the effect of masking the differences between categories and also even within ages. And it also ignores cohort effects. So I've termed this intersectionality invisibility. So in relation to combining the ethnic groups, the recent Commission of Race and Ethnic Disparities in the UK have really called for the demands to stop us using these aggregated categories. They've criticised the use of the term BAME that we use in the UK to describe Black, Asian and ethnic minorities, because this really does ignore the unique characteristics from an intersectionality perspective. The other challenge that we also found when we were looking at intersectionality in oral health, that it was actually quite difficult to find articles, find papers, and that was because some of the principles of intersectionality were actually hidden in social science journals and often buried in the narrative quite implicitly. And so these articles could be really easily overlooked. So we conclude that there is a paucity of research looking at intersectionality in oral health. So thinking about this in the paper, we were describing some of the reasons why we think that there's been a paucity of research in intersectionality in oral health. And firstly, if we think about it from a methodological point of view, I think one of the challenges that we have in oral health is that most of the approaches have used oral health surveys, existing oral health surveys, and secondary analysis. And these oral health surveys are not really designed to sample people in categories that are designed to be representative. And so because these categories are small in number, again, researchers have tended to aggregate these categories into wider categories. But from an intersectionality perspective, if we categorize white, Black, Asian, mixed, Chinese, from an intersectionality perspective, there actually may be more commonality between people in different categories than within a category. So, for instance, there may be more similarities in terms of culture between Black Africans and Asian Indians. than there are between Black Caribbeans. I think the final methodological challenge with research in intersectionality is about data analysis. And the question is, what do we do about the data? So there have been different approaches to handling the data in intersectionality. One is in the additive approach. And in this approach, it views social identities as entirely independent, distinct, and mutually exclusive. So often there's a master category such as ethnicity or sex, and that's deemed the most important factor. But from an intersectionality perspective, this is contrary to that approach because it assumes that you can somehow subtract someone's racial identity from their sexual identity and their racial activity. So we see this approach often in research that has tried to sort of control for race and socioeconomic status in data analysis. So the more acceptable approaches to intersectionality are using multiplicative approach, where researchers have tended to use into main effects or interactions. And the further approach is to use multi-level modeling and partitioning to look at variance. I'm not going to go into this too much detail because it's going to be pushing my level of multi-level analysis. What I would say is that at the moment, there is no consensus about what approach to use in terms of analysis of the data. But I think there's a danger that we can get stuck in data analysis debate about what approach to use, and we avoid more of the fundamental questions about intersectionality research in oral health. And that's really about epistemology. It's about what are the epistemological underpinnings of research. So I would say in public health, in oral health research, we've really been dominated by sort of deductive approaches that are hypothesis testing, positive paradigms. And this has often led us to focus on identifying inequalities. And this has left us, what I would say, in the category of the what question, without describing in more detail why do we have inequalities. So from an intersectionality perspective, social science perspective, they would argue that an intersectionality perspective is more grounded on what we call a social constructivist paradigm. And this is recognizing that knowledge and experiences are constructed within a social, political, and cultural setting. And this is probably better suited to sort of qualitative research methods that really tries to explore what the meanings are, what our lived experience is. For me, as a mixed methods researcher, I would argue that we actually do need strong intersectionality quantitative research. And we've had examples of this coming out now from Australia. But this should really be the starting point to help us move beyond, the what questions to really exploring the why and how questions. So we're not really at the stage of the transformational research really at the moment, because I think we're stuck in the descriptive stage. Strong intersectionality requires us to understand power and what does power mean. And I would say that we do have an absence of dialogue or discussion in oral health research about power. And Rizwana Lali has written a really great commentary that's been published in the Journal of JDR Clinical and Translation Research about power in dentistry. But power is complicated. I think John mentioned it in his talk about power and a political power. There are many frameworks that looking at power, many theories related to power. But I think the Schiffman and Smith political power framework is quite a useful framework used in public policy to try and explore power. And in this framework, it surmises that there are 4 types of power. The power of ideas. Who is defining the issues and who is describing the issues? Second, the power of the actor. So who are the individuals involved in the issues and what are their voices? Thirdly, the political context. So what is the context in which you are driving change or actions and what support they have? And finally, the power of the issue. So once these issues have been identified, what are the issues? Are they being driven forwards? So we can use this framework to, and I've just highlighted this in this paper to illustrate how an intersectionality approach encompassing power can help us generate more critical questions and critical thinking in oral health. So this is a paper, I'm not sure if you can see it. This is a paper that was published recently in the BDJ by Naz et al. And it's a paper that's looking at treatment preferences by ethnicity in adults in London. And it was in a secondary analysis paper. And they posed in this questionnaire, they had a hypothetical question about whether people would prefer to have a front tooth, a back tooth, or an aching tooth extracted or restored. And the authors reported through their regression models that Black Africans and Caribbeans were less likely to prefer keeping a back tooth, while Bangladeshis were more likely to state a preference for preserving a painful tooth compared to white British, and they after adjusting for confounders. So on the surface of this, we can take this as read, but if we start to look at this from an intersectionality power perspective, it helps us unpack this in terms of a power lens. So firstly, this paper prioritized race, so they were looking at ethnic differences as a master category to explain treatment differences, which raises the question, who decides on that this should be the master category, that race should be the factor that explains inequalities? It also raises questions about who decides. So in this analysis, they use the reference category in the analysis as white. So again, another power question is, who decides that this reference category should be white, and the way that we judge all the other categories against that? The third issue in terms of power also relates to what we call normative concepts. So power operates through professional norms and expectations. So in this paper, we're suggesting that root treatment should be the preferred option. That should be the normative option that actually shows that people value their teeth. And again, is that raising a question, is that a power position? And finally, the conclusion that treatment preferences by ethnic minorities might explain oral health inequalities. That again is another issue of power, and it really, could that lead to victim blaming if we say that actually inequalities are due to cultural factors? I think that's just sort of a snapshot of how we can use an intersectionality power lens to actually delve into some of the issues and some of the research that we're doing. So what can we say in conclusion in terms of how we can adopt an intersectionality framework in oral health? So I would say that the sparse application of intersectionality applied to oral health is really a missed opportunity in oral health to really delve in and to explore and produce more descriptive but also transformational actions if we really want to make a difference. I think the other issue about intersectionality is that it really does recognize that it is complex, and this complexity means that we need to move beyond sort of quantitative research, and we need to use more novel research approaches and methods to answer some of the more wicked questions that's exposed. And secondly, one of the things that I've realized just by working with so many different people in different disciplines is that it really does require us to work multidisciplinary to really choose out and generate these critical and challenging questions. So that's a whistle-stop tour through the journey of intersectionality, but the journey continues. My journey always continues. And the journey has continued to look at intersectionality and looking at the workforce. So I was joining the journey with Wana Lala and Sarah Baker. I'm not sure if Sarah Baker's on the call here, from Sheffield University, who I collaborated with last year. And we were looking at ethnic diversity in the UK workforce. And we published a paper recently as a special issue in the Community Dental Journal in 2021, and it's part of the IEDR conference. So in this paper, we actually looked at data from the UK, sparse data that we had in the UK, in terms of representation in the UK dental workforce. And what we found from this data is that actually ethnic minority dentists make up 29% of the workforce, despite only representing 14%. So generally speaking, we would say that the dental workforce is relatively diverse, much more compared to other health professionals, the veterinary science, other professionals. So if we look at that on first glance, but if we delve into that in more detail, if we take an intersectionality perspective and delve into that more detail, what we actually find is that actually that the majority of ethnic minority dentists are sort of Asian, are Asian, and that oftentimes when we report the data, it's aggregated, and this aggregation can sort of mask underrepresented groups. So we see that there are very few Black male and female dentists. And also the data on socioeconomic status is limited, but we do know that there are very few people in the workforce who are from low socioeconomic backgrounds. And also looking at intersectionality and the context. So if we move into academic and the academia context, we do see what we call a drop in the pipeline. So we know that ethnic minority clinical academics are underrepresented in dental schools at both the professor level and the reader level. So in our paper, we argue that by exploring ethnic diversity in the UK workforce from an intersectionality perspective, it does also highlight some power structures and exposes power structures. And so what we see is that we do have a leaky pipeline in terms of people progressing and moving through their careers in dentistry, in the academia. So if we look at power, so the issues of when we aggregate the data, again, that's a power position which can mask underrepresentation. The other power dynamic that we talk about is the fact that it's actually quite hard to get data. Very little data is publicly available. And this, again, could be seen as the power of the issue, which does create invisibility. The other, I think John may have mentioned it in his presentation about agenda setting. So what we see in the UK is that there is very much a priority set for gender equality. And this often means that race and class inequalities are often ignored and lower down on the agenda. And finally, there's very little research actually on intersectionality in the workforce, which again, one could argue that this is again another power position, a power of the issues, which means that we know very little in terms of research about what are the barriers that create this leaky pipeline. So moving onwards, the journey continues. The journey continues once again, transatlantic territories. Now, so we're moving towards exploring interesting academia. And Eleanor Fleming actually contacted me. She has a background in political science. She's an epidemiologist, and she works at Muirhead University in Nashville. And she was connected, made a connection through Mary Ellen. She was interested in the work that we had produced in intersectionality. So she approached me, and we started to talk about the US and differences between the US and the UK, which fascinated me, and that the context of having a historical Black college, what does that mean? So we started to unpack this issue, and we decided actually that we were going to be looking at that in more detail. We also were joined by Patricia Neville, who is a sociologist in Bristol, and she was someone who wrote some of the early work on ethnic diversity. In this group, our journey is joined again by Dean Farmer Dixon, who is the Dean of Muirhead University. And also finally, Marco, in terms of data, very interesting, some fantastic data from the American Dental Association. So in this paper, we're going to be looking at, really inspired to do a comparative piece, looking at specifically about dental academia, and looking at the differences between the UK and the US, so looking at contextual factors. So that's the journey continues. So there's just some questions that I just want to leave you with, possibly to stimulate discussion again on the journey. Something that we've covered, that I've spoken about in this presentation. You know, how do we promote a deeper exploration about power? How can we encourage multidisciplinary research that promotes strong, transformative oral health? And also, we recognise the challenges in academia. How can we facilitate mixed methods research when we have these barriers in terms of academia, in terms of grants and career progression? So that's a whistle-stop tour. I've probably done less than half an hour. And finally, I just want to end with an invitation to join the journey, where I love working with people. I hope this has stimulated your ideas. And if you're interested in the work that we're doing, please contact me. And there's some references.
Thank you very much, Vanessa. Thank you very much for that really stimulating, thought-provoking presentation that raises lots of very profound sort of challenges, both theoretical and research in terms of methodological issues. So lots and lots to think about. Let's open that up to some discussion now, because I think, you know, we could potentially debate some of the issues you've raised for a long time, but let's open up some questions from our audience, our very diverse audience across different countries and systems. Well, Vanessa, maybe let me start off, because I really enjoyed your presentation, and I really enjoyed this notion of intersectionality in terms of what it raises in terms of particularly the power dynamics, which I think is particularly interesting. How would you describe, because I suppose in some senses, if you take say a social determinants approach or a political economy approach, it's recognizing dynamics of proximal, distal determinants and the interactions across those that ultimately result in differentials across populations in terms of inequalities, etc. How would you distinguish what's unique and different between a, say, intersectionality perspective than, say, a social determinants perspective?
I think it's about, I think it's about the idea of this uniqueness about a person. So if you're looking at social determinant perspective, you're looking at, you know, I guess you're looking at the different layers. So you're looking at, you know, the individual layer, the community layer, and the wider sort of political layer. I think intersectionality is looking at the individual layer, but actually saying that, you know, gender, race, ethnicity, these are all combined and they're unique, and that we're not looking at, you know, gender separately, race separately. We recognise that there's uniqueness in being a Black, female, lesbian within the political context, within the time context. So I think that's where it's slightly different. I guess I know what you mean in terms of, I can picture the whole idea of these layers, but I think that's where intersectionality makes a difference. It's looking at that combined effect. That makes sort of sense.
Okay, no, that does. Well, good. How about other questions? Sarah Baker said, lovely presentation, really interesting, many thanks. Cheryl Wilmot, also very pleased to see the intersectionality discussions being raised into dentistry, so lots of positive feedback and comments. But any other questions of clarification or debate? Because, you know, this is raising some really profound questions. Well, maybe I'll do a go again, Vanessa. I did like your analysis of the personnel issue in terms of diversity in our workforce. And I think it's a very interesting point. And again, this is not unique to the UK, but if those of you outside of the UK bear with us a little bit. And I think this issue of, in the UK now, we do have a very diverse ethnic mix in terms of dentistry, but we don't actually, do we? Because it mostly is people from South Asian or indeed Indian heritage. So we don't, for example, have many people from a Bangladeshi background in dentistry. So even within the category of South Asian, there is differences between people of Indian heritage versus people of Bangladeshi background.
Yeah, and that's why I think on a surface level, when we just look at these categories, it's easy to say, pat ourselves on the back and say, yes, great, we've done tremendously well. And I'm not saying that we're not doing well in dentistry, because compared to things like veterinary science or architecture, but I think when we look at in deeper levels, we don't, and I think there's a paucity of research because we don't really know what are the barriers. And I think it's much more complex. I think the barriers, we don't know enough about the barriers and about why people choose specific careers.
And even thinking on a bit further about Vanessa, without being too personal, I can think of examples of some people from an Indian heritage who are exceptionally upper class, who have gone to Harrow, so in terms of a power imbalance, those people are coming from a very privileged background.
Exactly. So that's why I think it's very easy. And that's why it's fascinating with intersectionality is that those, just because, you're not just marginalized because of your race, there are other intersections that can make you actually privileged. That's what the concept of having this idea of being simultaneously disadvantaged and privileged based on these different intersections.
Yeah. Now we've got a question from Zoe. So Zoe Allen, do you want to ask your question?
Hi, thank you very much, and thank you for Vanessa for an excellent presentation. I wanted to ask a question about quantitative research. My background is more in qualitative research, and I can understand how we could draw out these intersectional concepts more within that paradigm. But for our colleagues who work in quantitative research, I'm wondering how they might be able to go about managing these intersectional concepts whilst simultaneously protecting people's anonymity. I'm thinking particularly because I work in the Southwest, where we have a relatively low proportion of diverse ethnicities, and it could start to actually identify people. So I'm wondering how that can be managed around the descriptive and quantitative research.
I think that's always a challenge about anonymity, and that's why oftentimes when you see data, there's this huge category that says preferred not to say, and I think that a lot of that is about being identified. So I think that is a challenge, really, and I'm not sure if I have the answer to that, but I think that is a really key question about feeling exposed and being vulnerable.
Okay, good point, Zoe. Now we've got Professor Sarah Baker has got a question. So over to you, Sarah.
Hi, thanks, Richard. Hi, Vanessa.
Hi, Sarah.
Lovely. I obviously think intersectionality is really interesting, and I kind of think of it as a conceptual framework, but I think that Richard's question was actually key about social determinants, because obviously, if you look at the social determinants approach and, for example, the World Health Organization framework, that in its way was trying to say something similar as you would think of as an intersectionality. And one of the difficulties I have with the social determinants is that the operationalization of that has been that everybody's looked at variables separately, quantified those variables, and then do regression models.
Exactly.
So I wonder whether, if intersectionality is now getting a hold within oral and dental research, whether in some ways it would make for really fascinating to try and bring those two things together, to kind of say, well, look, this is what we need to do. We need to look at how these things interrelate and push that forward, because it would be really, really useful if that was to happen, and not just by looking at interactions between variables. I don't mean that at all.
Well, that's why I didn't want to go into this discussion, because I think we can get stuck in that data analysis. What should we do? Should we be doing multi-level? What should we do partial teaching? And I think the issues are, if we want to move to transformational research, we want to make change and actions, then again, embracing a social determinants of health perspective. If you want to make policy changes, then that may be the way forward. Yeah, so I think I definitely agree that could be approach how we can look at both of how those both interact, both those frameworks.
Okay, good point, Sarah. Thank you. Any other questions? We're just slightly run over time, but we've done really well because I think both presentations have have covered a lot of very stimulating ground. So our Australian
someone said intersection differences within dentistry occupations. I won't second.
Oh, sorry, go on.
I think someone's asked a question. Is that Julie?
Julia, I think it was a comment, or was that a question?
Okay.
Well, you just stimulated my thinking. You were talking about intersectionality and looking at data on dentists, and it just got me thinking about hygienists and therapists and prosthetists and all of the others, and how those power relationships shift. Yeah, I think within dentistry would be really interesting to unpack as well. So thank you.
I think that's what we're doing. I think we're going to be looking at that in the paper comparative with the US, UK, looking at the feminization and looking at hygienists as well. So yeah, definitely that's a really good point.
I suppose another angle and I'm just looking at our audience, some people working from a sort of special or disability angle. The issue of disability would be another element in terms of an additional intersectional component.
Definitely, I think that's really key. And that's what I was saying, is that I think there are many missed opportunities, and I hope this is sort of stimulated.
Good. Well, look, I think we should finish now, but I really would like to thank both John and Vanessa for two really stimulating, very interesting, very thought-provoking presentations. Very different, but actually quite a lot of commonality across what they've been saying. And for me, issues around power dynamics, I think is an important one. But I think also actually the importance of people and that personal agenda and that collaborative research component, whether that's to do with policy or to do with research. And looking at the screen, really hope it's not going to be too long before we can start meeting up again in a face-to-face environment. I think some of the most stimulating discussions that we've had are when we are in the same room and can discuss and debate things. So hopefully that will move forward in due course. But I would really like to thank you all very much for coming along to this seminar. This is the last seminar for this academic year, but we'll have a new series of seminars starting from October onwards. And we'll have 3 different seminars again. If any of you would like to volunteer to speak, you can get in touch with me, because it's really good to have a diverse range of presentations. And I think that international component, because it is really mixed, and it's really lovely to see so many people, particularly from Australia, on the call this morning / evening. That's a particular joy. So I think with the Australians, you can all now have a nice glass of wine and put your feet up. And for all us British and Europeans, we'll all have to start working and getting on with things. So anyway, whatever you're going to be doing, enjoy the rest of your day and evening. And thank you all very, very much for your participation, and have a lovely summer / winter, whatever's coming up. So but look after yourselves and keep safe. Bye.
Bye.